Welcome to episode 35 of the People's History of Ideas podcast. This episode, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to present an oral history from an American who went on a delegation to China in 1971. She went as a Quaker peace activist, and after a few months came back to the United States a convinced Maoist. And just to give you some information, she's going to give you a lot of her own earlier biographical details at the beginning of the interview. The person I'm interviewing was named Monica Shay. She was named Monica Newbold before she got married, which is the name she had when she went to China. When I interviewed her, it was important to her that people know that it was that the interviews with Monica Newbold, just in case they were on the delegation or heard of it and would know who she was. She also, in political work, often used the name Kathryn. We don't really get into much of what she did after she got back from China, at least after the initial period. But in the 1980s and early 1990s, she was very involved in the movement in the Lower East Side of New York City, around Tompkins Square, and with the squatters and the struggle against homelessness. And then from 1996 until her death in 2011 was very involved in the movement against police brutality. In particular, working with families of people who had been killed by the police in the United States and working with those families to get their voices heard in the media and to get their demands out there. So before we just jump into the oral history here, let me give you a little bit of context for the interview. This interview was conducted in 2005, so 15 years ago, as part of the research for what was at the time my dissertation, and then later on the interview was also used for my book, which was sort of a modified and amplified form of my dissertation, Trans-Pacific Revolutionaries, the Chinese Revolution in Latin America. So the idea behind the interview was more that I was asking questions to get some answers for things that I had particular questions about for my research. Not so much to take down an oral history for posterity's sake, or to be published or released as we're doing now as a podcast. So, it's somewhat different than how I would do it if my original intention had been, to release it as a podcast. For example, I didn't follow up on certain things that I know would be of interest to some of the listeners or to myself, either because, I already knew the answer, or I was trying to sort of economically use the time we had to focus on specific questions that I needed answered for my research. So, in other words, the interview wasn't conducted with any audience in mind beyond myself and my own research needs. However, despite that, I think there's just a lot of value to the interview, and I think our listeners will get a lot out of it. Otherwise, of course, I wouldn't be releasing it. Another thing to note, it was done on an old 90-minute cassette tape, 45 minutes on each side, outdoors in Manhattan. So there's actually not a lot of background noise, but there is, just sort of the quality that comes with those old cassette tapes, including a break in the middle where I had to turn over the cassettes. So the quality isn't quite up to what one would really want, but the content is worth it. And so I think if you've enjoyed past episodes of this podcast, I think you will like the interview, or if you don't like it, you'll get something out of it or learn something. Just in case you're curious, I don't sort of in general view the oral history research that I did for my book as just sort of fair game to release on the podcast. But I did go and get permission from Monica's family to release the interview in this form. There might be some other oral histories I did that we'll be releasing in the future. The thing is, most of my research was done in Spanish, and this is an English language podcast. Most of my work was, of course, in Mexico, Bolivia, and Peru, which were the case studies I did for my book. So I don't know. We might be seeing some more of these in the future. This might be a one-off. We'll see. Certainly there's still some people out there who are alive that if I were able to get an interview with them, I would love to do ones that were just, done specifically for this podcast. So anyways, that's a whole other story. We'll see if something materializes in the future. One other thing to say about the interview before we jump in. Is clearly a little advanced of where we are right now in the podcast narrative. Some listeners may want to come back and listen to it again once we've gotten up to the 1970s, right? Monica traveled in 1971, so she's going to be referring to things in terms of the development of both the Chinese Revolution and the international influence of the Chinese Revolution that we really haven't covered the background for. But I didn't want to wait to release this interview because I think it'll give listeners an idea of a whole phenomenon that was a part of the movement of the 1960s and 70s that really doesn't exist today. It's a real window into the sort of development that went on back when China was socialist and sort of the global reach and inspiration that those ideas had, and which is really the overall theme of this podcast. So I just didn't want to wait to share it with you. So let's see. A couple other things to cover before we jump in. There are some names that come up. Some of you might not be familiar with. I'll also put those in the show notes. Bill Hinton comes up a few times. He was the author of a book named Fanshen, which was very influential in teaching people internationally about the Chinese Revolution and was a very supportive book and won a lot of people to be interested in the Chinese Revolution. He wrote a number of other books as well on China that are worth checking out. Most of them, I think, published and probably still in print with Monthly Review Press. Another name, Jiang Qing, comes up a couple times. That was Mao's wife, or his last wife. And she was one of the leaders of sort of the radical Maoist faction during the Cultural Revolution. An acronym that gets used a bunch is the RU, which stood for Revolutionary Union, which was a group in the United States, a communist group in the United States, which was pro-China. And there's a place, an agricultural commune, where Monica went and spent some time that she mentions called Dazhai, which was considered a very advanced agricultural commune. And there's a group there called the Iron Girls that Monica spent time with, which was an all-woman political group and work team at Dazhai. Anyways, those will be in the show notes as well. And let's jump into the interview. I guess my first question is going back 30 years, how did you become interested in going to visit China?
Well, how did I get to go, or
how did you become interested in getting to go to China? What made you want to go to China?
Right. Well, my parents were my mother had a philosophy teacher at Temple University whose name was Barrows Dunham, and he was a communist, and he was blackballed in 50s. He was actually, at a certain period of time, he was not allowed to teach at Temple University. And so during that period, my parents and possibly other people would organize circles in their own homes where he would come and talk and give lectures, and then people would collect up money or whatever, and that was part of how he got supported. Well, he, part of this circle of intellectuals and interest in sort of just, I don't know, it was sort of people who were into all kinds of things, like not only just the politics, but the sort of the designers and, just sort of a combination of intellectuals, really. but one of them was William Hinton. And so William Hinton came to these discussion groups, and then through him, they got to know sort of what was then the China Circle, which was rather limited, but it was Ida Pruitt, who wrote, actually I'm not sure I'm not sure the name of her book, but she was a daughter of a missionary that went to China, and she lived in China in the Revolutionary period. Adele and Alan Rickert, who were prisoners in China, I guess right during Liberation and immediately after, who wrote Prisoners of Liberation, and Maud Russell, who did the Far East Reporter. So they knew them, and then those people in turn came and gave talks at my parents' house. So even just growing up, and then of course Bill Hinton's mother, Carmelita, also was part of trips to China and things like that. So I remember growing up as a kid and seeing slideshows of China in my living room and talks by these people. So it was kind of part of the background of just this was another place that was, interesting things going on. But it wasn't really differentiated between China and Russia and Cuba and just stuff happening in the world. But then later, when I was in high school, actually, Hinton's nieces and nephews, we played with them all the time, and so they were a little more, even more politically savvy than I was, and the older boy in particular was really paying attention to a lot of stuff that was going on in China. And then Fanshen. So this, when I was in high school, was like the 60s. I was in 6th grade in 1963, and then I graduated high school in 1970. So during that whole period was the period of the 60s, and people were a lot more talking about, revolution and what was going on, whatever. And then these people were saying, particularly what was happening in China and what was going on, the Cultural Revolution and all that stuff, and they were more up on it and knowing what was happening. But I knew Bill's mother, Carmelita Hinton, and I knew her because she was part of the Reading Peace Association, and I went with my mother to the various anti-Vietnam War protests, and I was part of the Reading Peace Association. I was part of the Potsdam Peace Group, and my mother was very active and went into all the anti-war protests. So Carmelita Hinton knew me, and she knew me better than she knew my brothers. And at a certain point, which was 1971, it was after the ping pong team, but before Nixon, she got permission from the Chinese government to organize a trip of young people to go to China, which the group that went were people that she knew and that she recommended. So it included the Hinton nieces and nephews. It included people who had gone to Putney School in Vermont, which is a school that she organized, and friends of the family and people like that. But she particularly wanted me to go because she thought I was a promising young person, of whatever. And the requirements of people on this trip was that you had to just be of goodwill to China. You didn't have to believe in what was going on or know that much about what was going on, but you had to at least be open-minded towards what was going on in China. And so she raised through my mother, did I want to go? And this would have been my sophomore year in college, 1971 to 1972. And I said yes. At the time I sort of saw it kind of as just an exciting thing to do, an interesting thing to do. To some extent, I grasped it was different from just say going to France or going to Germany or something like that. But on some levels I didn't. And it was a little bit like I want to go for a trip. I want to go somewhere really interesting. This is someplace that really interesting things are happening. My older brother had left college for a year and tried to go to Cuba, but he couldn't get into Cuba, and he ended up going to Mexico instead. So some of it was like, this is what you do. You go and you see places and you see what's happening and you kind of understand what's going on around the world. So it's like the opening happened, and I said, sure, I'll do it.
So you went in 1971, right?
I was there, yeah. I was actually, sometimes I'm amazed. The years I was there, the time I was there, I think it was like the best possible time to be there. Because I was there from August of 1971 through the end of January 1972. So I was there, I got there 2 weeks after Lin Piao fell, and of course we were after the ping pong team, but when I left and came home was when Nixon was going over. So I actually think, and of course I didn't understand this at the time, but I actually think I got the best years because the fighting, the sort of the confusion and the factional fighting and all that stuff was sort of done with. We sort of were at the point where like there was a lot of results and like good things that were happening, and it was sort of in full flower. And I left before stuff started to turn and go the other direction. You know, but at the time I didn't know that. I just thought, hey, this is great, this is wonderful, you know. But I was there for 4.5 months, and at this time when just a tremendous amount of openness too of like what was going on.
Can you describe the trip? Can you talk about where you went, what you saw, that sort of thing?
Yes, we came in. We came in through Canton. We first went to Beijing. We traveled a bit around in that region. We went. We spent a month living and working in Dazhai, and at that time we traveled. We did a lot of sort of what was the agricultural, you know, situation, traveling to different brigades and different communes in that region. Always pretty much what we would do is we would work in the morning in the fields, and then in the afternoon we'd go and visit someplace and, you know, have a talk or a lecture or whatever. And then in the middle month we did just a lot of traveling, which I'm not exactly sure geographically where we went. We just saw a lot of different things, but I know we ended up in the third month. We were in Shanghai, and before we got there we went to Nanking and Yunnan, and then we ended up in Shanghai. And in Shanghai we lived and worked in a factory in Shanghai. And then I got allergic to the dust we worked at number 17 cotton mill factory, which was one of the advanced places in the Cultural Revolution. I was kind of not having a good time with some of the dust or whatever in the air. So I actually asked to work in the nursery there. So that's kind of the sort of what we did. We actually had a lot of range of motion in terms of determining what places we visited. A lot of that I didn't get so much involved in because I didn't really know enough, but there were people on my trip who did. There were people who kind of read a lot about China and what was going on and followed things, and so they would ask. They were the ones who asked to go to Dazhai or asked to go to this factory or whatever. Basically, they would ask about things that were happening, and they'd ask to go to these places. And again, something I didn't understand then, but I came to understand was that there was struggle among even our translators, with people guiding the tour. I think it was a combination. And now that, you know, looking back on it, it was a combination of clearly like revolutionary-minded young people who had been promoted through the Cultural Revolution and sort of the old guard. They were kind of our team that traveled with us, because like the older translator, who was like the head guy, he really didn't want us to go and live and work in the commune or go and live and work in the factory. He was really encouraging us to take a trip down the Yangtze and see the beautiful sights and stuff like that. And it was actually the people on my group who really argued for it, and there was enough at the time of motion or whatever that people said, oh, let them do what they want. You know, they want to do this, let them see that. So we actually got to go and do a lot of things that I get the sense later groups were even a lot more choreographed than ours was. But part of it is just even the whole experience, like even coming into the country, you know what I mean? It's like there was that's old Prairie Fire song, you know, got to the border and we began to walk under two flags flying. You know, then one was the bloody British flag of imperialism, and one was the shining red flag of socialism, right? And it's true. It's like you cross the border and it's like you immediately know you're in a totally different place. More than, you know, it was. I mean, it's a combination of not just the red flags flying, which was part of it, but also the billboards of being like, billboards and posters of slogans and pictures, and you know, the PLA and the people of the world and all that kind of, you know, sort of constantly the borders and the posters and all that. As you come into the airports, which for some reason I remember it more in Beijing and Shanghai, but than I do in Canton. I don't remember when we crossed the border there. I don't remember that part, but particularly I remember at the airports, I remember like tables, just rows and rows of tables, just loaded up with literature, Marxist-Leninist literature, all the collected works and the this and that, Lenin, Stalin, Marx, Engels, Mao, and the red books and all that, into all these different languages, and you could just, take them, So, I mean, a huge part of my collection was like you just went around, you took stuff, and you brought it back with you, But the other part of that was the political life on a daily basis that you kind of engaged at every step. In other words, going into the hotel, even when you first entered in Canton, you're going into a hotel, but not only is there the literature and all that kind of stuff there, but it's also that you can engage in political conversation with the hotel workers, about like what's your life like, what do you do, what do you think, and I think one thing that I just really struck me all the time I was there, and kind of something I remember a lot, is like how interested people were in the world. It was just like and we were visitors, and at that time, a lot of people in China hadn't seen Westerners. I mean, a lot of places we went, people hadn't actually seen Westerners. So people, like the little kids would come up and stare at you and stuff like that, or whatever. Just people would kind of gather around. But even so, people knew. Like people would come up to you and they might ask questions like, they might say things like, "Well, how did your landlords treat you?" Or "What's the life of the peasants like in the USA?" But they would also ask questions like, "Well, what's the Black Panther Party doing?" And what's happening with SCS and whatever. And this would be like not like the political people. It wasn't like you went somewhere and there's political people and they asked you these questions. This would be people that you're like walking around the streets, or like, you're in the hotel, or you're on the train, or what I mean. It was just like sort of a very lively, very alive place where people were actually engaged in the world and engaged in thinking about things, which just was like so amazing. I mean,
so you took a flight to Hong Kong. You
right.
went over in
by
Canton by train,
yeah.
And then you flew immediately to Beijing, or you spent
somehow pretty quickly we went to Beijing. I'm trying. I don't know why that was. I don't know why we went from Canton pretty immediately to Beijing, but I know that we ended up there. Well, maybe it wasn't even all that. Maybe we did some visiting first. We visited schools and some other things first, because I remember that we were in Beijing on National Day, so that's October 1st. So, and we had come in at the end of August, so there must have been some time in between. I don't quite place exactly where we were.
What was life like in Dazhai living there as a foreigner for a month?
One thing was they were, part of it everywhere, and this is true everywhere you went. I mean, the phrase was sort of like, warmly welcome the American visitors. It's like, just like as soon as you showed up, they'd have the gongs and the cymbals and everything, and it was like the drums and everything. It'd be like, let's warmly welcome the American visitors. It's like it's just sort of a constant phrase. But and then like if you went to visit, any workplace or anything, they put on a skit for you, do a songs and dance. People would come out, do songs and dances for you, for our American, visitors. And it was a pretty constant refrain that they were very clear on too. That like we don't like what the American government is doing, particularly in Vietnam, but we know that the American people are good. That was like a really strong refrain. But like certainly in Dazhai, they were very, they welcomed us in, and they were really like trying to teach us and help us and explain like the actually something I still do. Like one of the things we do when we were cutting sorghum in the fields, and you grab the stalk and you cut it with a machete, and part of what you do is you go like lu xiaoqi as you're cutting, but you'd also like say political slogans, and it's sort of like sometimes when I'm really kind of not in a good rhythm or something like that, sometimes it's kind of like I'll still like do something where I say a political slogan as I'm trying to do it, just because it gets the rhythm going, but it's something I remember from then. But we would actually sing, we'd be working in the fields, and they would be trying to teach us Chinese phrases, but they'd also be teaching us the songs, you know, the biggest one was the actually one that was sung all over the place at that time was the Tang Feng Shui. So it's the Tang Feng Shui, Zhang Bu Lei, Shen Zhe Zhe Yang Zhe Shui Pa Sui, Wu Shen Min Pa Mei Ti. Is it the people of the world? Who should be afraid of whom? Wu Shen Min Pa Mei Ti, or Shen Mei Ti Pa Ren Min. Who should be afraid? Is it people of the world that should be afraid of the imperialists, or the imperialists should be afraid of the people of the world? Da 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 tu, shete qua tu, isi pe la pu la cancha pu, cacacha. Then it's Mei Ti Ren Tu Mei Pi. So it's the imperialists will be defeated. Then the people of the world will surely triumph. So there'd be a whole like song, you know, you're singing this as you're cutting the cane and singing this as you're doing stuff, carrying it down the mountains or whatever. But also, you know, then again, if you do a cultural performance or whatever, then this will be done and it will be danced to and, you know, sang and like that. And then in turn, the other thing they would do is every time we went and they sang and performed for us, and they'd say, okay, now you perform for us. So they'd always in turn ask us to sing and dance, so that it would be like kind of trying to create a cultural exchange. So it was kind of, you know, and we were like limited. We were very limited. But, you know, the one thing we'd sing is like Joe Hill. You know, I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, or trying to think what songs do we know, you know, and you know, people would sing the Power to the People from the Black Panther Party and stuff, and teach people power to the people. You know, stuff like that. But you're like really straining your limits to like, well, our revolutionary culture is not that developed actually, you know? Or what we have is not even all that good, you know. But yeah, so the one there was this mainly taking us in, trying to help us, trying to teach us, and at the same time telling us about, constantly sort of telling you about what life had been like under the old system and what life was like now, what difference it made. Like that. We worked actually with the Iron Girls Brigade in Dazhai, and that was a group which actually had really struggled. You know, the whole question of women hold up half the sky. That even though this was a slogan that was said, it was actually not really taken to heart. And there was another saying that was like, if a man smokes if a man smokes even one pipeful of tobacco less a day, he'll do as much as a woman can do in a day. You know, because when you smoke, you're resting, whatever. So if you even just smoke one less, then he would do as much as a woman did in a day. So the Iron Girls went up against this, and they actually, like, you know, we can actually do what men can do, and we can do more, and we can contribute to socialism, and sort of, and it was really like there was a lot of struggle about that, a tremendous amount of resistance, and sort of like. It's kind of by the time we got there, I think that they were really upheld and promoted, but there had been a lot of feeling that this was not right, you know, that this, and actually apparently there was even struggle from, this was part of, earlier, there had actually been, I don't think so much in Dazhai, but in other areas, there had even been resistance from, in different places there was resistance even within the party to that, you know, kind of like, oh, you shouldn't strain yourself, you know, you should work, but you should contribute, but don't contribute too much, because let's face it, you're only women, you can't do as much as a man can do, that sort of thing.
Was any of that conflict apparent when you were there?
Some of it was, and I didn't really get it at the time, because I really wasn't that sophisticated when I went over. I mean, I was an anti-war activist. I was 18 years old, I was an anti-war activist, I was a pacifist. And I was kind of like, God, this is great, this is wonderful, this is fun, you know, I love this, you know. But there were a few things. I mean, one was this thing about the tour director and where he wanted us to go. He was very visibly upset every single time we argued to do something that connected us more with the people. And that was one thing that showed. I think another thing that wasn't as obvious to me then, but looking back, it's sort of part of it too, is the way that people would say, well, this used to happen, we used to think this, but now we think this. You know, it was a very like, it was actually, the lectures and talks tended to present it in a very, like, everything is fine now, you know, in sort of way, as opposed to even like, well, we're still working on this, or we have to struggle, you know, we have to improve more in this area or something like that. There was a little bit of a that was then, and that was all those bad people, and that was the capitalist roaders, but now we're firmly on the socialist road, and there was like sort of this kind of covered up kind of thing in a way of just, wanting to present yourself totally, free of any problems. But one of the things that struck us at the time was our last night there. We were going back through Shanghai. No, is that right? No, we must have gone back through Canton. We had to go back through Canton because we entered and left through Hong Kong. So we ate our last night at a rather fancy hotel. And the hotel manager would not allow our translator to eat with us. And he said because Chinese can't eat with foreigners. And it was a real throwback to pre-liberation thinking. It was actually kind of like, these are foreign guests and you treat them well, which means that no Chinese have to eat in the back room. So they separated our translator from us, and she was in tears. She was crying, and she was saying, "I can't believe this. This is your last night. I've been with you the whole trip. They won't let me eat with you. This is awful." And then also later, I was reading Roxanne Whitkey's book about Jiang Qing, and I recognized the same translator as being Jiang Qing's one of Jiang Qing's core of people around her. So it wasn't like she was a low-level, person, but it was clearly she was clearly assigned to us because we were like a new thing, and yet she could actually get into a situation where they wouldn't allow her to eat with us. And I think there were other things too, but mostly at the time, it was a little bit like, oh, that's past. This is now. We're on the socialist road, and you didn't really have all the sophistication to pick up all this stuff.
Can you talk a little bit more about how the delegation was organized in the U.S. and what section and who in China was in charge of coordinating it and moving it around?
Okay, yeah. Clearly, as I say, Carmelita Hinton, who at that point was 75 or something like that, was the pitch on the program was, I want to bring my grandchildren to China and friends and a bigger grouping of friends. So it was
that was her pitch to who?
I think she asked Bill, who at that point was in China. Bill was back in China at that time, and Bill's sister lived in China, and still did. Maybe still does. I think she does still, but she had gone over pre-liberation and stayed there because they thought that she was a nuclear physicist and that she'd given the secret of the atomic bomb to the Chinese, and so she actually couldn't come back to the U.S. So she lived in China all those years from liberation to when we went over, and afterwards she had married there. Either her husband was American too, so I'm not sure when they married. Maybe they both came over together. They'd both been there a long time, and they had raised their son there, who was Fred Angst, who was 17 or 18 at the time. So they'd been, he grew up in China. But Carmelita, I think she honestly started the thinking in her head as their grandchildren. Bill was over there. She relayed the message through Bill, who then got in contact, I believe, with Zhou Enlai. I think and it's my guess, I'm not 100% sure of this, but I think that Zhou Enlai was the sort of our patron saint. And I think that because, partly because the Hintons were kind of close to Zhou Enlai. Both Bill himself sort of like Zhou Enlai, and also Joan was very enamored of Zhou Enlai. But also the Americans in Beijing at that time, all of us, when we got to Beijing in October, all the Americans who were there at that time had a meeting with Zhou Enlai. So we had a meeting with, there was our group, and it was also Jack Belden, who wrote China Shakes the World. There were some other people that at the time I remembered their names or knew their names or whatever, and actually right now I don't remember who they were. but they were China figures. I mean, actually, when they said their names, I said, "Oh, I've read that book, or I know who that person is." So there were people who, and they were not. Some of them lived in China, but some of them were visiting China and whatever. But they were all Americans in China. And then Joe and I gave a talk to us that basically said, really, it was talking about the opening to the West. It was talking about that, in fact, for many years we haven't known people from your country, but we have a need to have people from your country come here and get to know us, and we warmly welcome the American visitors. And it's part, they explained it as part of internationalism, which is kind of how I understood it at the time. It was kind of a people-to-people friendship, but it would be a good thing for China if more American people knew what was happening in China. And I actually didn't understand at the time that it was also part of defending against the Soviet Union. I just didn't have that in my radar at all, but it obviously was. It was part of the strategic move of like, this is what we need to do. I think he was very aware that we were there, and I think stuff would have gone back to him, and I also think that, as I say, I think the translator, one of our translators, I'm pretty sure was one of Jiang Qing's people. So I think it was kind of known, that we were there at least. And they picked up the tab for all of our travel and everything like that once we got there. I mean, we paid our way over, but once we were there, we didn't pay for anything while we were there.
And was the trip undertaken with the permission of the United States government?
No, actually, it was illegal at the time. I mean, technically speaking, I'm sure that the U.S. had decided to, in various ways, look the other way or something. But at the time that I went, it was still on the passport that it was illegal to enter certain countries, of which the People's Republic of China was one. So that's why my passport was stamped twice: entered Hong Kong, entered Hong Kong. We never officially entered China. It's kind of yeah. Which my father, I mean, again, this is like, but my mother was kind of like, when I said the request from Carmelita came to my mother, who conveyed it to me, and I said yes. And of course, my mother was like, "Well, if she says yes, she's going." My father was kind of like, "She shouldn't go. It's illegal. She's a sweet little Quaker girl. It'll be dangerous. It'll be a very bad influence on her." He actually really opposed my going, and between me and my mother, we just sort of prevailed, and I went, which he never really got over either. Especially since I came back a raving lunatic cult person. It really bothered him.
So was this trip a forerunner in any way of the U.S.-China People's Friendship Committee?
Never, no connection. I mean, it was similar, and it had similar things to it, but it didn't. U.S.-China. I don't know even who organized it or whatever, but I mean, it kind of grew up on its own, and it had its own life, and it had its own politics, and it was an organization, and we weren't that, so we didn't cause it, we didn't relate to it in any way.
Did that exist at the time already?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think it did.
Can you talk some about? And you've talked about this a little bit already. But could you more specifically get into this question of what sort of freedom you had to talk to anybody you wanted to, or to move around and go places of your own will?
Yeah. I mean, people ask us, actually, we had a team of translators that was with us, and then a teeny bit into the trip, which was not maybe 2 weeks in, by the time we got to Dazhai, certainly, maybe before that, the Hintons came and joined us too. So at that point, it was Joan, Sid, and Fred traveled with us. And then actually much later, we also met up with Bill and Karma, his daughter. But that was later. That was like towards the end. But we, there was, I mean, there was basically we would have a discussion with people about, right from the very beginning, we sort of asked, where do you want to go, what do you want to see? and people put forward some ideas. Some people that knew more about what was going on in the Cultural Revolution that actually argued for certain things. But like, for instance, even when we were in Dazhai, we didn't actually, I'm trying to think who recommended it or how it came about, but at any rate, we sort of had a choice on doing a day trip, and some of the translators argued against that we shouldn't do it because it was too difficult and too dangerous, whatever. But then some of the other people said, no, we really want to do it. It would be a good thing to do. There was a brigade that was like a day trip, a day walking trip from Dazhai. So anyway, the people who were like very strong voice in our group went out, and we got to do this against sort of the recommendation of the older, cadre who was like guiding the group. And it was a walking tour. We went on a road that you could only travel by donkey or mule, and that there had been no trucks on, and that basically there wasn't that much traffic. And we went up this very mountainous place, and we went up to a village way, way up in the mountains. And they also couldn't have known that we were coming. I mean, actually, they got a little teeny bit of advance notice that when we got there that, I think somebody went ahead just to say they're coming, they'll be here in a day or something like that. But we got to this village that then, talked about all these questions too, like, what they've been through before liberation, what the path to organizing, all this stuff, right? But what struck me was that in this really remote village that had very little technology and nobody had been there, and you could only get there by this road or whatever, people turned to us and said, so how's Huey Newton doing? It was kind of like, and how did they know? They had a radio, and they would get the newspapers, and they knew from the Chinese newspapers who Huey Newton was. So that just really impressed me, because it was like kind of like there were people in the United States who wouldn't have known what Huey Newton was at that time. So there was just a level of interest and involvement. But we had that happen several times where we got actually to argue for certain things, where we got to say, no, we want to go here, we want to go there, and basically anything we argued for, we got. And but also many of our talks were very spontaneous because they were just in the course of daily life. Like, clearly, if we were out working in the fields, maybe, as I said, we happened to be working a lot with the Iron Girls, and they were a very developed political team. But when you were in the hotels, you weren't necessarily, the people cleaning the hotels were not necessarily the most politically advanced, but you would be able to ask them things about their life and what they thought about it. And then later, when we worked at the factory, the same thing. We would actually, you have off time. You have time that you're working, and time you're going places, and time you're just hanging around. Well, we'd be hanging around with people from China, and we would ask them questions about their life and stuff like that. So we'd just pull one of the translators over and just say, translate what they're saying, whatever.
Were you able to speak any Chinese at the time?
We tried to learn some stuff. We didn't really learn very much. We didn't mainly learn political slogans. And we could say down with U.S. imperialism, down with Soviet revisionism, down with China's Khrushchev, victories of the Chinese people along with Chairman Mao. There's definitely phrases that we knew, and you also got to recognize some things just because if you hear enough lectures day after, like, jaga, 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 jaga. So it's like, so that's what it's like. I forget now what it means, but it's like it's sort of a kind of word, that they do in Chinese. It's like certain words that they just say all the time. But we learned the words of certain songs, stuff like that.
You've already got into this question quite a bit, but I'm going to ask it just in case you have more to say about it. But what was the sort of sense of different lines in the Chinese Communist Party that you got when you traveled?
Well, one thing was, again, I'd say there was two people in particular who were on a trip who were just a lot more sophisticated than I was. One of them at the time was a member of the Revolutionary Union. and one of them was Hinton's nephew, who later died. Actually, he died in a swimming accident off of Cape Breton about 10 years later, or something like that. But they just sort of knew a lot about what was going on. And one of the things that they noticed, like we had been in China, I think we were there a week, maybe 2 weeks. Because I don't know if it was mid-August or end of August we went. But they almost immediately noticed that there was no mention of Lin Biao. They saw it. They saw it right away. They saw it in the newspapers and what's the daily paper? The Beijing Review. Yeah.
Remy Rebout, People's Daily.
Yeah. They saw it in that, and they noticed it right away in terms of when people were talking to us that they didn't mention his name. And so they said, "Did you notice that? Did you notice that something's happened? They're not mentioning Lin Biao," which at the time didn't mean that much to me, really. But they never, ever, all the time. So that was, we came in then. Now, actually, all the time that I was there, which I left then in end of January, beginning of February, during that whole period, that was never talked about or explained. And in fact, if anything, it was still kind of, it was really the People's Liberation Army. It was definitely, the hot stuff everywhere we went, during that whole period, which I guess there was just a lot of struggle going on there. That was a fairly, I think there'd be a lot of stuff that you wouldn't see. There was kind of more opaque to the unsophisticated eye. But particularly it was like the slogans, which included the workers, peasants, and soldiers, was definitely still like a main thing. Talking about the role of the PLA and what they had done and why they were so important. That was like a really big thing throughout the whole time. So we didn't really get into that much, and I think more. I just think more the little things, like just like I say, the one thing that happened with the hotel, the thing about the tour, but also sometimes people would say stuff. Well, actually, the one I picked up on the most, because I think I was sensitized to that at that point, was around the question of women. Sometimes people would say things in a certain way, and then say, but it really is true that women can't do as much as men, or they'd say different things or whatever, and you kind of like go. They would indicate that there was just not, not unity with that whole thing.
How were you and people in your group thinking about the significance of the Cultural Revolution at the time of your trip and then after the trip, both immediately and sort of over the years?
One is, even though I had the background that I had, and even though I'd known China and all that, I very clearly remember being like somewhat anti-communist, not consciously, but like when I first went there, it was like, you're not going to fool me, I'm not going to be taken in by your propaganda, I had to be open and of goodwill to China, but it was like, show me, kind of thing. So basically, anytime. I can remember the difference between when I first saw revolutionary operas and ballets within the first weeks that we got there, and I thought they were hokey, and how I felt about them by the time I left, which is that they moved me incredibly. But I can sort of understand sometimes when people from the U.S. or whatever look at them and they go, oh, that's hokey. It's like I go, I'm offended, but I remember that I felt that way. It's not American sensibilities, and it's also like, you have to understand what it really means, and like in Breaking with Old Ideas, when the woman says, holds forth her hands and or whatever it is, and it's like she can't write, but she can write one phrase, and it's like Chairman Mao is in our hearts or something like that. And it's like, that's really hard for American audiences to take, right? It's just like, oh my God, But then there's a certain point where that actually brings you to tears and makes you cry. Because it's like you just know what that means, But it's a different sensibility. I think when I first got there, I thought Cultural Revolution, one is I took it as a very light thing. Like I took it as a cultural revolution, and I thought it really was in the realm of culture, right? Which it was. But I mean, I thought it was more like changing some ideas, changing some things, and changing how they did their operas, and changing how they did their dances, and changing maybe how they organized some things, whatever. But I didn't really get the revolution part of it. I really didn't get it, and it was like that part of like really overturning, class struggle, and really being overturning some pretty seriously, question of like really dragging China back to capitalism or going forward to socialism. Definitely didn't get that. And after I was there a while, it was really a good month and a half before I even kind of got what was happening there. I think about that sometimes too, because I think it's like, well, I was seeing it, I was watching it, I was there, and I loved it. There wasn't a question. I enjoyed the hell out of it, but I didn't get it, and that what that means in terms of how long it takes people to kind of even change their thinking, and just because you present something to somebody does not mean that they automatically get it, right? So, but I was just sort of taking it all in and watching all this stuff and everything, and there was a couple things. I don't quite know why. That's the thing, I don't remember why, but I know a turning point for me was in the middle month. I got sick. I wasn't really sick. I had a cold or something, and they treated me like it's just amazing. Anytime anybody got sick, it was like the most amazing treatment. You know what I mean? They really took care of you, and that extended to, like when we were in the factory. And we were in a Shanghai factory. We actually saw while we were there that at one point there was a little bit of an epidemic of the flu or something. There was about, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12 people. I don't remember how many, but not that many people. Maybe 10 or 12 people had the flu or whatever. They shut down the whole.
So right here, the cassette came to an end. I had to flip it right over, and you'll be able to pick up from the context. Monica's still talking about how where she was working, where there was a flu outbreak, they sort of shut everything down, and
it was sort of routine. It was kind of like, this is how we function, this is how we operate. Got to take care of each other, got to take care of people's health. People come first. This was so constant, and so that really impressed me. But anyway, when I was sick, I spent 3 days in the hospital. Well, in the hospital, which was in a major city, and I'm trying to think. I don't think I was in either Beijing or Shanghai at the time, but I was somewhere which was a relatively major city. The hospital was empty, and I knew that because I went up and down the floors. When I was well, I traveled. I looked up at the fifth and sixth floor, and there's just nobody around. It was like I was pretty much the only person in the hospital. So that impressed me too. I was like, okay, but because we had already met like barefoot doctors in the commune, brigades and stuff like that. We had met a lot of people that were medical people, so we knew it wasn't that people didn't have medical care. And we'd gone and seen an acupuncture thing, and we'd been trained in acupuncture ourselves and a whole bunch of other stuff. So we knew a lot about what was going on with the healthcare system. But there I was in a hospital in a city, and there was like nobody in the hospital. I think that's really interesting. But more interesting to me too was like this. That was the doctors and the nurses, because the doctors and the nurses came and, oh, how you doing? What's happening with you? How you feeling? Took your temperature, so, and then they would sit down and discuss political stuff with you. So I read, the 5 constantly read articles, and then while I was in the hospitals, when I read the talks in the MM Forum on Literature and Art, And for some reason, that was kind of a turning point for me. I mean, that was like a real, like, one I really liked it. I liked the talks. I liked the approach. I liked the whole approach to artists and intellectuals. I liked the way it described what not to do and what to do and all that kind of stuff. But I just liked the feeling in it as well. It was kind of a love for the people and stuff like that. And I remember discussing it with my doctor, you know, and just we were talking about these things and talking about, you know, so how are you feeling today? And I said, well, actually, I'm feeling better now because I'm reading, and this is actually a true statement. I go, well, I'm feeling better today because I'm reading the Yan'an talks on literature and art. And it's the kind of thing that, like, you would hear people say things like that in China all the time, and you would think, oh, that's a hokey thing to say. You know, that's a bullshit thing to say. Why do people say stupid stuff like that, right? But then, you know, there it was, and I was saying it, and it was like either I'm brainwashed, right? But also it was very real. And in a way, you actually did feel like I'm getting a bigger picture of the world. I'm getting a better idea of how things can be, and you felt better, you know what I mean? So then we had a whole discussion about healthcare and stuff like that. But that was a major turning point for me. But anyway, so I think I started to get that I did get that it was a major transformation in society. I still didn't get that the amount of fierce struggle and fierce fighting. Not that they didn't tell us. Actually, when I was looking at my notes this afternoon, I realized that you'd go and in these talks and say stuff about there was a lot of struggle about this, or there was a lot of struggle about that, or there was some fierce fighting in 1968 about this, or I think part of it was the time when I was there, that I was there in 1971, and a lot of the actual, you know, you didn't see battles raging, you didn't see, you know, and it was like a lot less visible. A lot of it had been resolved. But I really didn't get how much of an upheaval it was and how difficult it was. I didn't get that. The only thing the thing I got by the time I left, I said a couple of things. I said, they've got something pretty amazing going on here. You know, it's kind of incredible. It's clearly the direction of the future. And it's more advanced than anything. Like we said, we would tell them that too sometimes. Like, I'm trying to think where else we were. Maybe it was when we were I think it was when we were in Dazhai even. There was at least one person who apologized for how backward the village was, even though economically, even though it was a very advanced place politically, right? There was somebody who said, you know, I'm sorry, like we had where you went to the bathroom and the communal bath place, whatever. It's like has the slits in the floor. You know, you squat and you shit in the slits. And there was like a village bathhouse, and we would take a bath once a week. And they had one radio for the village and things like that. You know, so somebody was saying, oh, you know, and that would have been a line struggle really that I didn't. I mean, that would have been a line struggle really, but someone said, oh, we're so poor, right? And we said to them, no, you're like, you may not have material things, but you are like way more advanced than what we have in the U.S. You know, you really, the way your social system and how you deal with each other, how you interact with everything, it's just like a lot more advanced than what we have. And then I didn't even understand that statement. I understood that when I was there, but I didn't understand that until going out of China. We stopped for 3 days in India. And then I really, really got it. And I was like, because people are coming up to us and begging and a whole bunch of other stuff. And I was like, oh, this is China before liberation. You know what I mean? It was like, the contrast was really sharp. It wasn't just that they were more advanced, you know, than the U.S., which they were, but they like really leaped, you know, through all this in such a short period of time. But a couple things I knew coming back, I said, well, you know, they're more advanced. They've got something going on here that's kind of incredible that people need to know. They use this philosophy called Marxism-Leninism. That's very important to check out and try to understand. And the only way I can ever like repay my debt for being allowed to be part of this is to try to make revolution in this country. And I knew a few other things too. I knew that like sort of you had to like serve the people, but I wasn't sure what that meant. That meant different, you know, that was kind of more like be good to people or something. That was kind of like serve the people was like be a nice person and be good to people. And you know, then, and I remember coming back to college, and people ask me about it, and I say, well, I know that, they say, well, how are you going to make a revolution in this country? And I'm like, well, I know that the proletariat is a very important part of that. And they say, well, what's the proletariat? I'm like, I don't know, but I'll find out. It was kind of like, it was like, that's really kind of where I was at when I came back, though. You know, I mean, I still wasn't a communist or a revolutionary. Well, maybe I was a revolutionary. I knew that what they had was better than what was going on here. And I guess when I left to go over, I was probably an anti-imperialist. So it was kind of like, this is bad, that's good. They have this philosophy, this is how they did it. What does it mean for here? I have no idea. but we'll try to find out, and we'll try to hook up with other people that are doing this. And, part of it was, obviously I think I had a great time. I had a great experience. I don't think there was a combination, though, of, like, sometimes people think, well, like my daughter would say to me, oh, well, you were just brainwashed or this. No, I don't think so. I do think I saw the advanced places. So obviously, and it was at a great time. So obviously it's going to, if you say all of what was going on was what was happening in those places, that would not be correct. And Bill Hinton kind of makes that in his book, Shen Fan. It's kind of like the Longbow Village, that really some of the more backward places had a pretty rough time. And certainly over the years, I've followed a lot of the books that have been written about the different things in the Cultural Revolution, stuff like that. And I'd say the one thing I've gotten more of a sense of the complexity and the deepness and the difficulty, and the pain, and sort of a recognition that there is some pain involved in this, which I don't think I really conceded before. But on the other hand, if anything, it also makes it stand out even more. It's kind of like, this was an incredible leap for humankind. It really leaped like huge gulfs of decades, centuries of human existence. And it went to a whole future place. It didn't go everywhere. It didn't complete everything, and it wasn't thorough. And we still have to do a lot more. But it actually stands out sharply as what an incredible leap it was. In terms of all that stuff.
Was your level of understanding of what was going on with the Cultural Revolution about the average for the group that you were in?
Oh, I think so. I think it was. I think it was probably relatively. And different people, have different understandings. But I think most people got it about that level. Because you asked originally about the composition of the group, it was there was like 4 of the Hinton nieces and nephews. There was me, who was a friend of Carmelita from the Peace Group. There was this guy from Reading who was part of the RU. There was a guy who was the son of the woman in the Philadelphia Peace, whatever. There was 2 people who had been students at Putney, and there was 2 black women on the trip. One was from Reading and one was from Philadelphia. I'm not sure who they hooked up with. They were very, you'd have to say at this point, you would say very nationalist, which again, I didn't recognize that. That was all part of it. That was all part of the 60s, and it was all part of that was just a really good thing, But they were very, very conscious, not only of the black nation, but also they sort of had, they had the Black Power slogans, they had, certain things, whatever. And they were also, critical of people just for being white a lot of times, It was it's like they weren't always right. But they also got conceded to a lot because it was like, well, yeah, but if they're black and we're white and they say this, then we probably are wrong. And, there's a lot of that going on within the group. There's a lot of internal tensions within the group, and then part of how we would try to resolve it was we'd read on contradiction, or we'd read, something and try to have a group meeting and try to resolve it. But part of how I think that my understanding was about average, and maybe it was less than average, but I think it was about average, was that not too many people after they came back actually became active in this country. Really, the only ones I know for sure out of that whole group, I know of 3 of us, who actually, the guy I was mentioning from the RU is still definitely very active. But there was another one, the women from Baltimore was active for a while. And the other people, I don't even know what they did. I don't know what they, so like, what did you do with having been there and seen this? And, I just, it seems to me that like they had a sort of an appreciation for what was going on, but they couldn't have gotten it, you know what I mean, in some kind of fundamental way. Like, because to get what was going on there, you'd have to say, I got to try to do this too, and it's going to be different, But I know even when I first came back, part of what I really wanted to do was just talk to people about what I had seen. And I did that for a little while, and then a trip, talks and college circuit talks and everything like that. And talk about, my trip and whatever. That's what I did for a little while. But that was part of it. It was like, this is happening over there, and this is happening over here, and how are we going to bridge this gap,
On this delegation, did the RU exercise any sort of influence or try to, or was it just sort of some guy who was along?
He was some guy who was along. I didn't really, I sort of got to know him like a couple of years later, At the time, I consider him somebody who was like a little more knowledgeable. He was like with the Hinton nephew. The two of them were like kind of like, they would say, oh, Dazhai, or oh, this, or oh, that. They would have they knew who Lim Gao was, that sort of thing. But they didn't really, so they influenced us by just talking in the group. But other than that, I didn't really know what the RU was. I knew that he was from the RU, but I didn't know what the RU was. So in that sense, there wasn't an influence on the group.
So they weren't making a concerted effort to influence the group then?
No.
Definitely not.
Right.
Okay.
Right. There was actually a meeting of, this you could say, the only thing I was just saying before about Hinton probably shouldn't be repeated, but this is actually fine. Because Vakian talks about it in his book, The Memoirs, but I was in China at the same time he was. And we actually met the same time that there was the Americans meeting in Dazhai. There was an RU delegation there that was from the Central Committee that met with, they didn't meet with Zhou Enlai at the same time we did, but they did meet with Zhou Enlai. And so then we saw them again later. Like actually, I remember seeing Bob in Dazhai. It didn't mean anything to me at the time, But he came through Dazhai and he was like, "Oh, we know you. We saw you at the meeting and like that, So they actually were. They were definitely having delegations and stuff like that even at that time. There was a lot of people though. I met Huey in China too. I met Huey in Canton. So it really was. It was just after the ping pong team and before Nixon. It was just that. I guess it continued. There was an opening for the West that continued, but this was really like a more. It was a more formative period. It was just when they were first trying to do that, and they didn't really know what they were doing, and so all kinds of people came through.
Was Huey Newton part of the Black Panther delegation?
No, it was just by himself.
Can you talk about meeting Huey in Canton?
I didn't. It was kind of. Actually, we just went up to him. We said, "Hi, Huey." And actually, it was the two black women on our team that first recognized him. And then they said, "Oh, that's Huey Newton." So we went over to him, and then we said, basically, it was one of those like. Well, we really admire the work that you're doing and the work of the Black Panther Party. Oh, thank you very much. That's kind of you, whatever. Okay, good seeing you. Goodbye. It was really that kind of a meeting. It was hey, I saw Huey the other day. But it was enough that you knew that there were people, coming to China. I was like, that was what you did. That was the thing to do.
Going back to this question about summing up the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah.
At what point after you got back did it become... Well, what were the various stages of development of the meaning of the Cultural Revolution to you after you got back?
Okay. Like sort of what changes in my thinking or what like that, or what did I understand about how it developed, or...
Yeah, how did your understanding develop of the significance of what you had seen, and in general your understanding of the importance of, or your understanding of what the Cultural Revolution represented as time went by.
Okay. Well, I think the first whole section of time, which maybe at least went up through when Mao died or something. And I think the main thing I got, or the main thing that I was understanding about it, but was trying to apply, was this question of the masses, or the makers of history. I didn't really understand it in relationship. I didn't understand the Cultural Revolution in relationship to the history of the ICM, and I mean, in other words, okay, that's not true. I mean, when I came back, I first went around and first I tried to talk to people about China. I also tried to find Maoist groups, and I actually traveled around to different cities. And at that time, there were all these different little Maoist collectors all over the place, and there was also all these people's bookstores all over the place. And it was just like you could walk into any city and you could say, "Where's the Maoists?" and somebody would direct you to what grouping of people there were. And my approach at that time was kind of like, I'll just keep going until I find the particular little group that I like, and it's the most like me, and then I'll hook up with them, and then we'll just keep going until revolution, right? So actually, part of what happened with me was I was doing that, and I went back to school, and I also hooked up with a group that was doing stuff there, and I also hooked up with the New China Study group, and I was doing talking to all these people. And it was really when I came to visit the person who's now my husband, but he had a little collector up in Rochester, and I explained to him what was my philosophy, in terms of like, well, I'm just going to go around, travel around, see all these different little groups. And he goes, "Sister, I don't think you got an idea. This is not a good strategy." He says, because really, we're up against a pretty major enemy. This system, it's a pretty big system. It's organized pretty powerfully. He says, you have to actually seek out, you have to read the programs of the biggest different groups, and you have to hook up with the one that's the most organized, that's the most, has the most best strategy on how to do this. And, even if there's some differences or whatever, this is sort of, we have to actually get organized because we're going to have to go do this, I'm like, oh, that's an interesting idea. So I was approaching it at all. I was approaching it like it'd be a lot of fun, just go around and hook up with these different people. But I think what I was sort of trying to put into practice and what I learned from it was this question around the masters and the makers of history, and also what is the proletariat, and sort of like the question of learning from the people, because I was raised and trained as an intellectual, and I was at Cornell University at the time, and everything. So I really didn't know very much at all about the actual life of the people in this country. I just didn't know that. But also, I wouldn't have known that was worth knowing, because that wasn't my training. My training was all like, you got to be in the realm of ideas, and you got to people who think with their minds. They're pretty incredible, but everybody else is shit, and all that. So this was kind of a whole sort of way of looking at people, and understanding that. People know some shit, and people can do some shit, you know what I mean? And so, going into I did work. I went to work at a hospital. I learned from the hospital workers there. I don't know, like, it actually ended up influencing a lot of stuff that I did, where you really were just trying to get to know the life of the people. We're trying to understand, like, I did not know that much about the history or the life of black people. I didn't know what it was like to be a worker, all this kind of stuff. So that there was a number of years where what I was doing was engaging in social practice, I guess, or just, getting to know people and getting to understand what was going on. Then, I think, and around really when Mao died, up until that point, life had been fairly simple and straightforward. It was just a matter of time, because it was so clearly such an advanced system, and it was so clearly such a better thing, and that's the way the whole world was going, and everybody was making revolution, and we were clearly headed that way, so it was a matter of time, and it was just going to happen, and it was kind of easy, And then Mao died, but also all this stuff started coming out about, different people, not only he died, but the Gang of Four was overthrown. And then in the course of that, there was other stuff about, these people, these capitalist rulers had taken over. And just as he had said that as they might do, which up until that point, we had always thought that was just a nice saying he had. It's kind of like, he's kind of warning us, he's saying some nice stuff, well, blah, 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 if this happened, and the capitalist rulers could easily rig up the 8-point work system, whatever it is, the 8 system, the work point system, and do this and that. Thanks, Mao, thanks for giving us a warning. Yeah, we'll be careful, we won't do that. Really, that's what he's saying these nice, because I remember being in discussions with people, and they'd say, well, this is happening, and that's happening, and this is being overturned, and that's overturned. I'm like, don't worry. The Chinese people are revolutionary. They're all Marxist-Leninists. It's not a problem. Well, don't worry. Yeah, some stuff's happening, but they'll figure it out. They're getting the right road. So then it was like clear that there was a little more serious problems, and really, I mean, I didn't know what to make of it, pretty fundamentally went into denial for like from 76 to about, I don't know, sometime well into the 80s. I mean, I know that there is an analysis, that the party made. It was like I didn't disagree with the analysis that the party made of that. The legacy of Mao Zedong and Mao makes 5, and sort of the whole, basically, I agreed that they had been taken over by capitalist rulers. And I even sort of understood, like in the legacy of Mao Zedong, in the Lost and Legacy, it sort of explained some of the conditions that made this possible. But I couldn't understand it. I really couldn't understand it. I was like, I don't know how it happened. This is pretty much impossible. I just really don't get it. And the only thing I can hope for, and that hope continued for a very long time, was that somehow it will just reverse itself. And it's like, okay, there's ups and downs in the revolutionary struggle. They got overthrown, but clearly they're going to come back. So then, when I say I was in denial, I mean in that sense it was like, so probably sometime in the mid-80s, like at least by 84, 85, 86, by that time there was like this wave of, like anti-Cultural Revolution stuff coming this way. So just like, all these horror stories of the Cultural Revolution. Well, at first, of course, it was rather easy to dismiss them because you'd say, I mean, some of them are pretty clear. Like this person does actually. Some of them you can just kind of wave away, a little bit by saying like, oh, this person never went along with what was going on. And this person kept quiet while this stuff was going on. And this person didn't, clearly does have the piano player who was forced to go to the countryside and like their knuckles were made cracked or whatever by digging in the dirt. And so sometimes you can sort of say, well, I feel sorry for the person, but really, in the scheme of things, this is not the most terrible thing that could ever happen to somebody. So there's a lot of like both dismissal and denial. Mainly, the more I tried to engage in the class struggle in this country, the more I just realized at least it's complicated. Which is, in other words, just in the sense that people don't give up their old ideas very easily. People don't really like to be struggled with. People don't really like, people will shut up rather than say what they think, if they're going to be struggled with. There's a lot of stuff where a lot of people go along with whatever's going on at the time, and that the appearance of it is sort of like, well, that's, what people think and believe, but it's not necessarily, something that they'll be able to stand up for and fight for. Also, the thing I'm kind of wondering about now is I can only really ever remember people talking about socialism. I really don't remember people talking about communism. In other words, there was a very clear thing of like, we're in a socialist, country, and it was also pretty clear that you either go forward to communism or you go backward to capitalism. But I really don't remember people talking about we're on the road to communism. You know what I mean? Which now I'm beginning to think that's somewhat significant because it's kind of like there is a question like, well, where are you? How much, and on what level did people grasp, eliminate the flaws, and all this stuff, right? And how much was that even part of people were very politically conscious and people were very politically engaged. But even there and even then, how deep was that, even for the majority of people, And so I'm sort of I got that sense, like in the last 5 years, 10 years, but maybe 5 years especially, but that there's levels and there's levels of what people understand and what people put out and what people, are saying and what people understand, what people go along with. And that, what made it kind of incredible was this great big leap, and that there's all these people participating in it, and it was really raising the level of people politically on a vast scale. On the other hand, how, it had to go further. You know what I mean? In a lot of ways, it really had to, people's grasp of Marxism and Leninism was not that deep. It actually wasn't that strong. Which is also, and then when you add to that there definitely was class struggle even within the party, and there were mistakes made, and people weren't able to actually either oppose those mistakes or sum up those mistakes or fight against those mistakes, or all that kind of stuff. You sort of add it all up, and you're like, it was a quite incredible, unbelievable experience, but it really did run up against some limitations too. And so I guess that's sort of where I'm at now.
So, you mentioned that you ran into these other groups of Americans there.
Yeah.
What other foreigners did you run into, or were you aware of there?
We did run into a lot of foreigners, a lot of different nationalities. We didn't run into so many while we were at Dazhai, actually, or even when we were in Shanghai. But when we were in Beijing, we got to meet a lot of people. There was a Filipino group that we interchanged with. There was an Iranian group. There was an African group. I'm trying to think who else. A Korean group. We saw a Korean opera. We saw a Korean dance. Those are probably the main ones I remember. But they would teach us their songs. We would teach them our songs, that type of thing. It was like we'd actually spend some time together.
Did you have any interaction with any of the foreigners that were resident in Beijing, working with foreign languages press, or any of the foreign language editions of Peking Review or China Reconstructs?
Not that I was aware of. In other words, we did have that one meeting of Americans. I think I met, for instance, Hinton's first wife also lived in China, and I think that's what she did. I think she did some foreign language press stuff. And we met her once, but not to really have a discussion with. And I didn't. No, actually, a lot of the names, the people that wrote books and stuff like that, a lot of them I read their books after I got back.
Did you have any sense of how China's approach to delegations from the U.S. or from European countries would differ, might or might not have differed from its approach to delegations from third world countries? Or is that a too artificial of a breakdown? Should this be broken down into other different types of delegations or relations with people coming from different types of countries?
Huh. I don't think I had enough to know. I certainly didn't get just of the ones that we met, the Africans, the Filipinos, and Koreans. We didn't get any sense of differences at that time. In other words, it was kind of like all one big happy family. It was sort of like we got the sense that we had the sense that they were both treated with respect and allowed the freedom and allowed to do the same types of things we were allowed to do and that sort of thing. And that they were allowed to intermingle with us and we could intermingle with them. We didn't get any sense of any differences.
How would you characterize those delegations that you ran into as being ones tied to political groups or more people-to-people type exchanges?
People-to-people exchanges. Students, actually. Most of them were students.
And the Korean group was from which Korea?
I was from North Korea. Yeah. And their opera, saw their opera, which was quite bad, actually. It was very bad. It was like sort of the worst stereotypical dogmatic thing you could imagine, and we could recognize it, then. It was just like bad art.
Were you involved at all after your trip in U.S.-based solidarity work for China?
I wanted to be. I actually really did want to be, but I wasn't. Only for the first, right after I came back, I tried to get the group that had gone together, and I suggested we write a book, and then immediately after, like for that, maybe that whole next. Actually, went a little bit longer than that, but certainly that summer to that fall, I did campus speaking, different places, and actually there was enough people who were actively wanting people to speak about China that it didn't take much. I mean, people would actually just call you up and say, "Oh, I heard that you went, can you come out to Illinois?" And can you, I did like several campuses. They would pay you an honorarium, that sort of thing. I was actually did that quite a bit. That continued, let's see, so we got back in February of 72, that would have continued almost up through about October of 72. And then in October of 72, I got more connected with a group, which was the Local Show Union. And I was 19 at the time. And there was sort of like a little bit of a this and that about, well, should you do U.S.-China friendship stuff, or should you do brigade work? And since I was 19 and I hadn't completed college, it was like, well, it'd be more useful if you there was plenty of people doing U.S.-China friendship work at the time, and it'd be more useful if you did student work. So I kind of didn't really, basically that was kind of it. I didn't really do anything after that. I gave my slideshow to different people, groupings of people at different times, like more personally or whatever. But I didn't really write stuff or talk or do anything like that. But also from 72 through 76, it seemed like it wasn't that needed, And part of the things when this argument was made, well, it seems like it's more necessary for you to go on campus and organize young people. That sort of made sense to me because at that time there were more and more trips going to China. There was a lot of there was workers. The RU was organizing workers' delegations to go, and pretty much every time you turned around, there was a delegation going to China, and plus there was other people going to China. And basically, at that time, the belief was that everybody would get to go to China sooner or later. My husband always thought he was going to get to go. He just figured, I'll go to China sometime. And then in 1976, Mao died, and he was like, no, it was a closed. It had a finite period. But that was part of it too. It was just there were so many other people doing it that it didn't seem like it was as critical to do that.
Were these later delegations legal, or were these delegations still illegal?
I don't know for sure. I have a feeling it probably became legal. I'm not sure when it became legal. But it had to almost have, because after Nixon went, how could it have? They had to have changed the visa status, but I'm not sure about when that got changed.
There wasn't formal diplomatic recognition until 79.
79? That late?
Yeah.
Wow. I didn't know that. Huh. I don't know then. They were able to do it with relative ease.
Clearly the U.S. was at least looking the other way.
Right.
How would people at these campuses know that you had went in order to invite you to give you an honorarium?
Gosh, I don't know. I don't remember. They had to call somebody. They called somebody. Who would I get a call from? I think some of them knew people who knew people on the trip. I think there was some of it was like that there was, there was word of mouth of people that had been on the trip to these different campuses. Somehow, I'm really not sure, somehow it got into some kind of speaker circuit or something. Somehow it got known that there were people who had been to China and who were willing to come talk. Because I would get calls from campuses that I didn't know anybody there. The first ones I obviously did my own campus, and I also did my brother's campus, and I did a couple other things like that. And somehow, I don't know, word got out in some way.
How many did you speak at?
6 to 8.
6 to 8.
Yeah. And the black student, the other thing was the one place they were disappointed because they just assumed I was black. I'm not quite sure why. They'd gotten their information mixed up or something. But I was actually flown out there and given an honorarium, and I was organized by the Black Student Association. And then when I got off the plane and they picked me up, they're like, "Oh, you're white." And it was a surprise. But they handled it very well, and everybody handled it very well, and they were kind of, didn't mind it so much. But I think that might have been, I know because the two women that were on the trip were black, somehow that fed into that somehow, that the information was crossed. So I don't know what role they played in that.
Can you speak at all to how some of the U.S.-China solidarity work developed and who coordinated it in the U.S. and in China, or who it was coordinated with in China?
I'm not that familiar with it. I knew there was China Books, which was really, that's how everybody got their literature and their posters and everything else. And China Books had a direct contact in China, and I don't know who that was or what circle of people that was.
Was China Books run by the Chinese government?
No, it was people from this country, but they had connections. They had pretty good connections. And then there was China Books. There was China Books New York. There was Everybody's Books San Francisco. But they would actually have they'd have everything. They'd have the red books. They'd have the classics. They have the posters. They'd have the Mao buttons. Most of the all your basic revolutionary literature, more than was actually being produced in this country at that time. It was like when people went for revolutionary literature, they went for the classics and Chinese stuff and things like that. So in a certain sense, China Books and Everybody's Books were kind of your supplier for revolutionary literature in this country in the 70s, 70 through 74, 75, something like that. And U.S.-China Friendship Association was definitely a United Front organization. It was a mass organization. It was a United Front organization. The Revolutionary Union was in it, but it wasn't even the main voice in it. It wasn't the initial organizer of it, and it wasn't the main voice in it. It actually just participated in it, and there was just a lot of people in it that were friends of China, in one way or another, just friendly towards China, whatever. And then they would organize people to do talks and this and the other thing. So I don't know exactly who originally got it all together. And also, it lasted a long time. It lasted after the overthrow of Mao. And it took I don't know when it died, but probably sometime in the 80s.
Is there anything you'd like to add? That's pretty much the end of my prepared questions, but if there's anything, important you think I'm not asking about or anything you'd like to add, please feel free.
Sure, the part that and sometimes I can't even remember the different facts, or sometimes I can't even remember all the different stories, but the part that feeling that I can remember, and I guess it just really impressed me so much, was this just unbelievable revolutionary optimism throughout all society. It's sort of like I've tried to sometimes explain it to people, and I have trouble describing it, but yeah, and like the way I describe it is sort of like that, the feeling that people have when they come together in a demonstration. That's a nice demonstration. I mean, there's some that are nasty, but it's like when you've organized for something, and there's a whole bunch of people, and you come together, and you just sort of feel really good. You feel really good towards each other, and you feel really good towards. You feel conscious, and you feel like you did something, and you also feel like you just have good feelings towards the other people, and you're also like kind of picked up by a certain enthusiasm, and so you're kind of mentally really stimulated, and you're also like, I don't know, you're just on good terms with just like everybody in the world or whatever, and it was kind of like being like that for 4.5 months. It was just like, it wasn't just somewhere where you go and you feel that for a couple of hours, in a certain context. It was like constant, and it was everywhere.
All right. That's it for our interview with Monica Shay. Next episode, we'll be back with China in the 1920s. Take care, and I'll see you then.